Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Housing affordability, and a crisis in housing right now is got to be the number one issue. And I read a really interesting column by Carol Whitzman, a professor, a housing and social policy consultant, and an expert advisor on the Housing Assessment Resource Tools Project, on that this should be the number one priority for the federal government, and that it is a federal government responsibility. And I was really quite impressed with it. So I thought I'd reach out to her to find out what she's got to say. Carol Whitzman, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian.
So tell me, why do you think this is a federal government responsibility? Our prime minister didn't seem to think it was.
Well, it's not particularly an opinion. It's based on almost 100 years of housing policy since the first Dominion Housing Act was passed in 1936. It's also based on the fact that the federal government has spent, or will be spending, $89 billion between 2018 and 2028. I don't think you'd do that on something that is not a federal priority. And I'm basing it on the fact that not only has Canada signed up to a whole bunch of international agreements on, such as a covenant on social and economic rights created by the UN, but also has passed the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019. And just to put a little plug in for Canada, it was a Canadian who helped write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So it's not sort of this opinion I thought up one day. It's sort of based on a lot of history and a lot of facts,
$89 billion is how much the federal government is spending on housing in 10 years from 2018 to 2028. That's a huge amount of money. What are we spending it on?
Unfortunately, not necessarily the right thing. So the federal government's had 3 phases of involvement in housing policy, particularly after World War II. It helped enable over 1 million homes for returning servicemen, homes for heroes, victory houses, whatever you want to call them. From the 1960s until the 1980s, the federal government provided grants and low-cost financing to build enough social housing that it was 10, and in some years, like 1971, even 20% of housing construction. And then the federal government exited the stage in 1992, but it re-entered with the current government and the National Housing Strategy in 2018. And most of the money this round hasn't gone to social housing. It hasn't created the same kind of amazing outcomes as the post-war intervention. So most of it has gone to private developers for mostly grossly unaffordable housing.
You're saying that the federal government is spending $89 billion over 10 years from 2018 to 2028, and it's not building social housing. It's somehow going to the developers. And why would it be going to developers to build what you describe as unaffordable housing? I don't understand.
That's a really good question.
Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense.
Okay. When the federal government was elected, there were some programs that were put together, and it was before the National Housing Strategy Act. They got rolled into the National Housing Strategy. The biggest program, clocking in at 26 billion, is called the Rental Construction Finance Initiative, and that provides low-cost loans to mostly private developers, and about 3% of those homes, mostly studio apartments, are affordable for a period of up to 20 years only, which is much less. Like the federal government used to be funding social housing that was affordable for 30 to 50 years. This is for 20 years, and only 3% is affordable to people who are in core housing need, households who are in core housing need, and homeless people. But the targets of the National Housing Strategy are to end housing need for 530,000 households, and to eradicate chronic homelessness for, estimates vary, and part of the problem is that we're estimating, but maybe 35,000 individuals.
So you're saying that the money is being spent by the federal government, but it's just being misdirected.
Yeah, and it's, again, that's not just me, that's everyone from the Parliamentary Budget Office to the National Housing Council to the Auditor General. There's a consensus in at least 6 or 7 reports that have come out in the last year, including House of Commons hearing on the National Housing Strategy, that the money is being very poorly allocated and that the policies bear no resemblance to the targets, which is, I do study policy, and that's bad policy.
And so where is this money going if only 3% of it is being spent on studio apartments that are considered affordable? Is it just being given as low interest rate loans to developers that don't actually need it?
Yeah, well, the notion was that purpose-built rental kind of fell off the cliff in 1972, quite a while ago, when the federal government stopped providing a range of tax exemptions, accelerated depreciation, a number of other taxation levers that were there that were supporting purpose-built rental. And, throughout the 90s and 2000s, under both liberal and conservative governments, there was very little purpose-built rental being created. So the idea of the Rental Construction Finance Initiative, as the name suggests, was to get some oomph back into purpose-built rental. 2 problems. The first problem was the purpose-built rental was already starting to get invested in again because of huge demand for purpose-built rental. But secondly, there was very little in the way of affordability in those conditions. So in the 60s and 70s, there was an emphasis on housing that would be affordable to low and moderate income households with an income of less than 80% of median income. And this time there was a definition that was made up for that program and had nothing to do with what the CMHC traditionally considered affordability and traditionally considered the people most in need, who are undoubtedly the people most in need, who are low and moderate income households.
Sounds like we need to appoint you Minister of Housing.
Well, there is a new Minister of Housing and Infrastructure. The good news is that Sean Fraser is a Minister of Housing and Infrastructure. It makes sense because housing is critical infrastructure. And I mean, the guy's been on the job for less than 2 weeks, so I'm not going to, individually go after him. Thank you.
Sounds like we do have a problem, though. And if we're spending this amount of money and you're saying it's misdirected, and the Prime Minister is saying it's not a federal responsibility, it's not a federal priority, I think we got an issue. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Carolyn Whitzman in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Carolyn Whitzman. She's an adjunct professor and housing researcher at the University of Ottawa. Our topic is the crisis in housing, and a column that Carolyn wrote recently, really taking the Prime Minister to task in regards to his statement that housing is not a federal responsibility, or not primarily a federal responsibility. And she says it is, and that we're spending a fair amount of money. I think Carolyn is the right person for us to be talking to. She's a housing researcher at the University of Ottawa, as we mentioned, a housing and social policy expert. Currently, her main work is as an expert advisor and outreach coordinator for the Housing Assessment Resource Tools project based at UBC Housing Research Collaborative. She's also undertaken contracts with the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the Canadian Urban Institute, the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing, and ITERA Women's Resource Center. Before that, She was a professor of urban planning at the University of Melbourne and wrote on transforming housing, affordable housing for all. Before that, she was a senior policy planner in the city of Toronto for almost 10 years, where she coordinated citywide gender-based violence prevention initiative, the Safe City Committee, helped develop $1 million grant program providing the cycle of violence. She's got a doctor of philosophy, a PhD in geography, and interesting enough, the thesis was on neighborhood transition in Parkdale, and it won a Canadian Association of Geographers Award for the best thesis in 2003. I'd like to read it because I used to live in High Park, just beside Parkdale, so I'd be interested in what happened there.
Brian, it was published as a book called Suburb, Slum, Urban Village by UBC Press. So it's still in print, which is
I'll have to get one.
Please do. And I thank you for the opportunity to plug that book. It's a pretty good book, if I do say so myself.
And so Parkdale, is it a good example or a bad example?
Oh gosh, Parkdale's a really interesting example. So my whole thesis, PhD thesis, was on sort of stubborn developers who were trying to create affordable housing and the various levels of government, particularly the municipal government, that was for sometimes very virtuous seeming reasons blocking it. So I'm a big time YIMBY. And the story in Parkdale was that it had a reputation, even when it was first created, certainly in the 1980s, as this stable residential middle class suburb. It wasn't. There was really small workers' cottages. They're still there in Parkdale if you look hard enough. There was industry in Parkdale. More importantly, most of the households doubled up. They subdivided houses. They created rooming houses quite often. When the man died, his widow or his single daughters would run the house as a rooming house. So Parkdale had a long history of rooming houses, of what we call now single room occupancy places. And each time the city government got to it, they went, oh my goodness, it's becoming a slum. We have to do something about that. And that went on into the 70s and 80s with the shutting down of bachelorettes. And again, I'm not saying that the bachelorettes were great places to live, but they were the only affordable housing, and particularly for deinstitutionalized psychiatric patients from the Queen Street Asylum, as it was called then. It was the only housing choice. So, if you're going to close down housing, at least create better alternatives. And unfortunately, the city of Toronto, and it's not just the city of Toronto, wasn't very good at that. It was better at closing down options than it was in creating affordable options.
I interviewed the deputy chief economist for CMHC last week, Alid Irwath, and he and Stats Canada recently made a major report on the housing affordability crisis in Canada, and they said that the most important reason why we had a lack of affordability was lack of supply, and the reason why we had lack of supply, they put on municipal red tape and regulation that slowed down approvals. And it was interesting because they said that the slowdown or the time it took to get approvals was the number one issue, and the red tape, the actual restrictions, were also problematic, but were far less important. And they didn't mention the federal government at all in their analysis.
And yet Alid works for the federal government. Yes, I know Alid's report, and I also have written a report that's coming out in about 2 weeks from the Federal Housing Advocate that's looking critically at that report from the CMHC that says that 5.8 million homes have to be built in Canada by 2030. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of schools of thought / warring factions, particularly on the artist formerly known as Twitter, I believe it's known as X right now, around supply versus, say, rent protection or rights-based approach. I actually think both are true. I think that every level of government bears a certain amount of blame. And part of the issue is that every level of government points at one another and says, you're the problem, no, you're the problem, no, you're the problem, when they actually should be acting together.
I spoke with Dennis Mills, former member of parliament, on Friday, and he said that Toronto is the major issue, and Vancouver, I think, is also an issue. And he said the only solution was to have the mayor, the premier, and the prime minister sit down and have as a number one objective solving the problem and getting all together. Sounds like you agree.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that there does need to be some sort of roundtable convened by the federal government. There was, there are regular federal, provincial discussions going on. Definitely the Federation of Canadian Municipalities could be included. I think there needs to be a place at the table for First Nations. But I also think it should be expanded to include private developers, nonprofit developers, and finance actors, banks, etc., because they're all part of the solution. And the problem right now is that definitions of affordable housing, targets, mechanisms, policies, they're actually quite contradictory when it comes to different levels of government, and that's not going to work for anything.
I think it really came to issue most recently in the recent Toronto Mayoralty by-election that has held, where Olivia Chow and other members of the sort of the left side of the equation were speaking mainly about solutions to social housing, and people on the right, supportive of the Premier Doug Ford, et cetera. We're talking mostly about affordable housing for everyone, the middle class potentially. And the solutions that the right and Premier Ford were based on was increasing supply generally, such that a general level of affordability would increase, prices would come down, or supply would go up, I guess. While Olivia Chow focused on primarily that social housing. I ended up speaking with one of the main campaign chairs for Olivia Chow, and she said both are the problems and both need to be the solutions. What do you think the answer is?
Well, if you're talking with Mitchell Hay, I've talked to her. I would agree that we've put housing in these three very disengaged silos. There's the homelessness silo, which is at the moment very much the city's responsibility, and shelters and that sort of absolutely last ditch end of the pipeline stuff, and there needs to be permanent housing options. And frankly, the private sector can't produce those kinds of very low cost housing. That's partly because welfare rates are really low and minimum wage hasn't increased with cost of living in general, housing more generally. Then there is affordable housing for low and moderate income people, and that is just not available. Like there's a 0% vacancy right now for housing that's affordable to low income people, not just in Toronto, but in Hamilton, Ottawa, etc. So it's hard to imagine how the private sector right now could address the needs of households that can only afford to pay, say, $1,000 a month if they are dependent on a minimum wage. And there was recently a report that came out that said that two people, both in full-time secure minimum wage jobs, can't afford a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto or Mississauga or Hamilton or really anywhere in the GTA at this point. So there is a need for social housing, but you can't disentangle it from the fact that housing completions, and particularly purpose-built rental completions, have an increased, and in fact, in many cases, have decreased since the 1970s as Canada's population has doubled, and particularly as Canada's population increases in coming years. And I'm very much a fan of increased immigration. But just to give the example of international students, we're giving temporary visas to international students with absolutely no guarantees that they won't end up in homeless shelters, as some are, in the lineup for food banks, as some of them are. That's not a good deal. It's not a good brand for Canada. It's not a fair deal for international students at this point. So we have to get beyond this notion of, on the one hand, silos that have nothing to do with one another, and on the other hand, this notion that generic supply will solve it all. There's a long history of the CMHC in particular, and Canada more generally, saying what kind of housing is needed for whom, where, and at what cost. And that's sort of a basic, that's housing policy 101. You start off with, okay, who needs housing? Where do they need housing? What can they afford to pay? Do they have any particular needs in terms of accessibility or in terms of, social or health supports? And then the policy goes from there.
CMHC in 2018 came out with a major report on housing. And Alid spoke about it a little bit when I spoke with him last week. And it was scary because, as you mentioned, the construction of housing has gone down dramatically. So much so that on a per capita basis, it was less than half of what it had been in the 1960s and 70s. So we're building, substantially less housing than we did before, and even more so if you did it on a per capita basis. And at the same time, housing prices had increased dramatically. And he said it was more profound even in rental accommodation than it was in homes that you could purchase, homes or condos that you could purchase. How did we get to this situation?
Well, as I said, it's a failure by all three levels of government. So, the federal government can't pretend that its tremendous success after World War II wasn't due to it giving money to buy up land, working with municipalities and in some cases provinces, and then providing, in some cases, pretty directly, that is building itself, some low-cost housing at an absolutely industrial pace. I was reading about victory houses the other day. I'm a historian by training, so this kind of stuff excites me. They could turn around a house, and those houses, sometimes called strawberry box houses, they still exist in the GTA, other parts of Canada. They could turn one around in 36 hours. Well, part of the problem is that we've sort of lost that industrial approach, and that we haven't had any major increases in productivity in terms of housing. We're still building housing in just two flavors. Mainly, we're producing sprawl housing that's eating up agricultural land, etc., and we're producing high-rise condos, and that sort of missing middle that everyone talks about isn't happening. And part of the reason that missing middle isn't happening is because of municipalities, absolutely, and a long legacy of exclusionary zoning that increased over the years to exclude anybody who couldn't afford a single-family home. Absolutely, and that needs to be addressed. And I would suggest that the fastest way to address it would be the federal government coming out with a recommended zoning code. It's already hinted at that in a current program called the Housing Accelerator Fund. Absolutely, the federal government isn't in charge of zoning. The provincial governments are, but while you wait around for 13 governments to come up with 13 different solutions, or even worse, while you wait around for 700 municipalities to come up with 700 different solutions, it might be a good idea to have a federal recommended zoning code and to link it to infrastructure funding.
You think the federal government should get so involved in areas of responsibility of municipalities and provinces that it should have a federally mandated zoning code?
I don't think it can mandate it, Brian. I think that there's already a federal building code that needs to be looked at, because the building code represents values and housing production of about 50 years ago. So, for instance, when you look at European cities and you look at those lovely 6 to 8 story joined up buildings that provide a lot of affordable housing, that can't be built in Canada. And why it can't be built in Canada is a combination of zoning and the building code. Absolutely, I think the federal government should come up with a recommended zoning code. Yeah.
Fascinating. That's interesting. It's an argument that I haven't heard before, and I appreciate you putting it
Oh
forward.
no,
It's interesting.
it's already happening. Again, the Housing Accelerator Fund, and I don't know where they pulled this one out from, but the Federal Housing Accelerator Fund says 4 stories as of right in all residential areas, and 10 stories within some really large distance, 1.5 kilometers, I believe, of rapid transit station. That's one way to do things. But in any case, it's already a place where the federal government is sticking its oar in. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't stick its oar in. I'm saying if it does come up with a recommended zoning code, it should probably be based in a little bit more consultation.
We're chatting tonight with Carolyn Whitzman, who is a housing expert, about Canada's housing crisis, and an article that she wrote just last week that suggested that the federal government needed to take a lot more responsibility and had responsibility in housing, and it should be one of their key priorities. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Carolyn in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is housing affordability. Our guest is Carolyn Whitzman. She is a housing and social policy consultant and the expert advisor to the Housing Assessment Resource Tools Project. She wrote a really interesting column that I read just recently that really took the Prime Minister to task in his comment that housing was not primarily a federal responsibility, and she suggested it was a federal responsibility and it should be a federal government priority. Dr. Whitzman, let me ask you a question. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, and the Premier of British Columbia actually have taken a very activist role recently in Ontario. Bill 10, I think it's 109, Bill 23. There's been numerous different things that have really been the provincial government really overriding municipal responsibility and jurisdiction over a lot of things in regards to housing, and trying to cut down NIMBYism, trying to cut down the ability of conservation authorities, of neighbors, of other people objecting to proposals, etc. They've also used ministerial zoning orders to, in the case of Mississauga, in his example, double the density that the city had approved on Lakeview and on Huron, Ontario, dramatically increasing density around major transit zones and things like that. All oriented toward increasing supply, which they say is the number one problem. Trying to reduce time, though, doesn't seem to thus far have had a major impact. Really, what ends up happening is municipalities don't deem development applications complete because they don't want the clock to start ticking and how they've got to respond to development applications. Do you think the provincial government are doing the right things to try to reduce NIMBYism, reduce regulation, reduce red tape, and to increase timing of approval?
Well, I'm going to distinguish between the approach of Ontario and BC, Brian, if that's okay. I think that definitely the provincial government needs to be involved. It needs to be involved, for instance, in providing land for non-market housing. And one of the things that Ontario did recently in Mississauga was it sold off a very large and well-located piece of land from Metrolinx to a private developer without a scintilla of direction around affordable housing. So that, I would argue, is exactly the wrong approach, and really kind of it points to one of the real problems with the Ontario government's approach to supply. There just is no consideration of what kind of housing might meet the needs of people in housing need, or might address homelessness. It also doesn't really look at where development should happen. So here you have a location that's right next to a GO station, and there's no consideration of people who might not have money, for instance, to have 1 or 2 cars and might need well-located housing that's close to public transit. If you look at the past, the Ontario government, along with the federal government, along with municipal governments, were really good at using government land, nonprofit land for low-cost nonprofit housing. So that would be an example of where where the Ontario provincial government isn't doing a good job. I'm not saying that BC is fantastic, but at least BC started off with some sub-targets around students, around people who are homeless, around people who are in housing need. It started off with some understanding, for instance, of the need for well-located 3+ bedroom apartments and flats. So you see in Vancouver, for instance, there's a requirement for 35% 2+ bedroom apartments. So, those are the kinds of considerations around who needs what kind of housing where that I don't see happening in Ontario. I do see happening in BC, but even in BC, and I'm not saying BC is perfect by any means, the level of infrastructure funding that's necessary to provide the amount of housing for the growing number of homeless people who are just not able to find the most basic adequate housing is really disturbing. And I don't think that BC can do it without federal help, and I don't think that Ontario can do it without federal help. So there's a role for each level of government, definitely. Land has something to do with it for all 3 levels of government. With the provincial government, they definitely should be supporting housing first, as for instance, Alberta is. A right of center government like Ontario that's been promoting housing first now for over a decade. So it has something to do with right and left. It has a lot to do with evidence and with some slightly deeper thinking about people's needs. Not everybody can or should live in tract housing in Caledon, let's say. That's just not where everyone
let's
should live.
let's talk about this for a second, because you sent me a really interesting presentation by the Housing Assessment Review Resource Tools HART overview for short, and I was astounded by this. You showed the percentage change in Toronto in housing for different income levels. And overall, there was a 4% increase, which didn't sound like a lot. This was between 2016 and 21. So over the course of 5 years, a 4% increase in total number of houses, which to me seemed very small compared to the fact that, we hear this rumor that we've got more cranes in Ontario or in Toronto than anywhere else in North America. So I was surprised by that. But then I was shocked when very low income is down by 27%.
Let's talk about that, Brian, because
more than a quarter of all those people in that income level, according to these statistics, had to have left Toronto. And you've got
no, sorry. Let me be really clear about that slide, because there was no sort of when I'm doing the presentation, I talk about the slide. That is to show something really specific. Canada engaged in a really interesting natural experiment in universal basic income during COVID. That chart shows the impact of CERB. It shows the impact of the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. And what the Canada Emergency Response Benefit did without any housing policy whatsoever is reduce what Statistics Canada calls core housing need by 250,000 households between 2016 and 2021. Unfortunately, CERB was a temporary initiative. The reason why I included that slide is to say that the numbers from the 2021 census, which are the numbers that we use, are a gross underestimation of low income need, because 27% of very low income households in Toronto, and I have a similar graph for all of Canada, were temporarily pulled out of core housing need. They were not spending more than 30% of their household income on rent, simply because of CERB. So if the provincial government wanted to increase welfare rates, or if the federal government wanted to bring in universal basic income, that in itself, without anything done on housing, would have a huge impact on housing need. That's what the meaning of that graph was.
Okay, I misunderstood. So that actually is a good result, albeit for 2021. And I guess what it's saying is this guaranteed annual income CERB be helpful if it had continued, at least for the very low income people.
Yeah, there was an experiment in Ontario around basic income too, which for whatever reason, the current government, Doug Ford's government, stopped not only the experiment, but stopped the evaluation of that experiment, which I thought was a little bit, again, not evidence-based. And the fact is, you can do two things around housing. You can vastly increase income, and frankly, Canada Housing Benefit, Ontario Housing Benefit isn't doing that single-handedly. And or you need to build a lot more low-cost housing. And I think you need to do both. But yeah, the purpose of that particular slide was to show that guess what happens when you increase people's income to $500 a week or whatever it was, people can suddenly afford their housing. And that's a really important point to make every once in a while, that housing policy intersects with income policy. It intersects with immigration. It intersects with taxation. It intersects with health and social policy. And, you know, the federal government can wipe its hands of that as much as it wants to, but these are actually issues that are best led at the national level.
And then you have another chart on affordable housing deficit and the core housing need. And you say there's 1.451 million households that need housing that don't have it. And I was surprised you actually have that there's 1,435 people in high income that have a core housing need. I don't understand how that exists. The vast majority of people that have a housing need, about 1 million, are in the very low income or the low income. So explain that chart to me if you could, and why you've got rich people.
So the rich people are mostly in the north, and there are some issues around the adequacy of housing in the north, to make a long story short.
Okay. But so even though they're rich, the housing is still expensive. So 1.5 million people.
Yeah.
Or 1.5 million houses, not people, but 1.5 million houses that that are need in core housing need. And then you also go on to describe numerous different people that are not included in your assessment of core housing: homeless, hidden homeless, you say, that are involuntarily doubling up, students who are living independent, people in congregate housing like rooming houses, people on farms, etc. So the 1.5 million you're saying is an underestimate of people that have this housing need. So we got to have 1.5 million right now for people that have got core housing problems.
I wish we could have 1.5 million right now. And keep in mind that it was 1.7 in 2016, and I am 190% sure, whatever the more than sure or certain is, that after CERB ended, we're closer to 1.8 in what Statistics Canada officially calls core housing need.
And
now,
so,
for absolutely political reasons, in 1991, sorry to jump in, they decided to exclude students. That's crazy, but that's what Statistics Canada did, and what the federal government has continued to allow them to do.
So I apologize. Core housing need means they don't have a house, or they have an inadequate house?
They have an inadequate house. So 90% of core housing need is primarily because households are spending more than 30% of their pre-tax income on rent. That's an international standard of lack of affordability. There are also some households included in core housing need who are overcrowded. So an entire family in a one-bedroom apartment, for instance, which happens definitely in some high-rise towers in Peel, for instance, as well as Toronto. And there are some households who are there because their housing is in such poor state of repair, it's inadequate. Those are the three criteria that would put you in core housing need. But as I say, sorry, my neighbor just came by in a wedding dress, so that distracted me for a moment. Those are the three elements of core housing need. But as I say, 90+% of core housing need comes from lack of affordability. But just to go off on a little bit of a tangent for a moment, if you'll forgive me, one of the things that we don't talk about when we talk about housing need are people involuntarily, young people staying with their families beyond the point where they could form they prefer to form a household. I'm not sure what your age is, but I went to university in the 80s. And even though I went to university in the same city, Montreal, where I grew up, I lived with a couple of roommates, and that was great, but a lot of people can't do that these days. Another aspect is not being able to stay in the city where you're working and have children. So, for instance, my son, who's 30 now, and at the age of 30, in Petite Histoire, he was 1 year old, and my husband and I were just buying our first house. But he's 30, and he has been unable to move out of a one-bedroom apartment with his partner in Ottawa, and that's a very common complaint for people of that generation, that they just don't have access to larger homes, home ownership that's in the cities that they work in.
I spoke with Mike Moffat. He's a professor at University of Western Ontario and also does housing work in Ottawa. And it was interesting. He said, to your point, that the biggest change in his students over the course of almost 2 decades that he's been teaching is that 15 years ago, his students at the Ivy Business School, some people think one of the top business schools in Canada, were very optimistic about their future. And he says today they're not. And the major reason why they're not as optimistic is they don't think that they're going to be able to buy a house, that the housing, the dream of having a house, our kids no longer have. And he described that as a travesty.
Thanks to the miracles of Zoom, I was teaching housing policy in 21 and 22 at the University of Toronto, even though I live in Ottawa. I had about 35 undergraduate students, most of them in their 20s. And I started off the class by saying, how many of you think you're going to be living in Toronto in 10 years? And Brian, with one or two exceptions, the answer was 0.
I think this is a huge priority for our federal government. I think economically it's a problem because of productivity and the health of our cities. But I think it's a moral issue as well. And that's what you are speaking of. Carolyn Whitzman, thank you so much for joining us tonight and telling us a little bit about how you think that housing and housing affordability, particularly for the people at the low end of the income scale, is really a priority for the federal government, is their responsibility, and has to be something that the Prime Minister and the new Minister of Housing and the government focus on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.
We're going to take a break and come back with some final comments of my own on this housing affordability crisis that we have right now. Thank you.